The morning Alma Redmond walked onto the Keller property with nothing but a worn leather satchel and a spine straighter than a fence post. She had no idea she was about to change the course of two lives forever. The year was 1878, and the panhandle of Texas was not a place that forgave weakness. The land itself seemed designed to test a person flat in some stretches, then broken suddenly by dry creek beds and scrub oak that clawed up from the red earth like fingers reaching for something they could never quite hold. The sun came early and hard in that country, and it stayed long past welcome, bleaching the color from everything it touched. The towns that dotted that landscape were rough and practical, built for function and not much else, and the people who scratched out a living there wore that practicality like a second skin. Alma had arrived in the town of Redrock 3 days prior on the southbound stage, carrying everything she owned in that single satchel and $42 she had earned over 2 years of cleaning rooms in a hotel in Abilene. She was 26 years old, brown-haired, brown-eyed, and possessed of a particular kind of quiet determination that people often mistook for coldness until they knew her better. She was not cold. She was simply a woman who had learned very early that the world did not hand things to people like her, and so she had developed the habit of going out and taking what she needed with both hands. Her mother had passed from fever 2 winters back, and her father had been gone since before Alma could clearly remember his face. She had a half-sister somewhere up in Kansas who had married a shopkeeper and sent polite letters twice a year that said nothing of substance. Alma had come to Redrock because she had heard, from a traveling salesman who had stopped at the Abilene Hotel, that there was good land in the Texas Panhandle, and that a woman who was willing to work could find decent employment on one of the cattle operations that spread across the region. The salesman had meant laundry and cooking, of course. That was what men like him meant when they said a woman could find work. But Alma had other ideas. She had spent those 2 years in Abilene not only cleaning hotel rooms, but spending her off hours at the stock pens at the edge of town, watching the drovers work the cattle, studying the way the animals moved, the way a good hand read a steer before the steer even knew it had been read. She had always had a gift with animals. Even as a girl, she could calm a frightened horse that no grown man could approach, and she had a patience for the work that most people simply did not possess. She wanted to work cattle. She wanted to be useful in the way that mattered out here, in the dirt and the wind, not confined to a kitchen or a washboard. The problem was that nobody wanted to hire her for it. She had tried 3 operations in the first 2 days after arriving in Redrock. The foreman at the Hollister spread had laughed, not unkindly but laughed nonetheless, and told her the boys would not stand for it. The manager at the Double C Ranch had been more polite but equally firm, explaining that the work was too dangerous and that he had a waiting list of experienced men who needed the positions. The third ranch, a smaller affair run by a widow named Prentice, had actually needed help but only for domestic work, and when Alma had gently redirected the conversation toward the cattle pens, the widow had looked at her with something that was half pity and half admiration before shaking her head. On the evening of her second full day in Redrock, sitting in the small boarding house run by a stout and cheerful woman named Mrs. Haverson, Alma had asked about the other ranches in the area. Mrs. Haverson had set down her coffee cup and folded her hands on the tablecloth with the deliberate care of someone choosing words carefully. "There's the Keller place," Mrs. Haverson had said. "6 miles northeast, Bernard Keller. He runs a good operation, good cattle, good land. He's been there 12 years and built it up from almost nothing, and he knows this country as well as anyone alive." Alma had sensed the hesitation in the pause that followed, but she had prompted. Mrs. Haverson had picked up her coffee cup again. "He turns away hired hands, has for the past 2 years. Nobody knows quite why, though there's plenty of theories. He used to run a crew of 8 or 10 men, and he managed fine. Then something happened, his father died, some people say, or there was trouble with a previous hand, depending on who you ask, and he closed up the operation to outside workers. He does everything himself now, and I do mean everything. People have tried to hire on, he sends them away. Young men, experienced drovers, even men he's worked with before, he turns them all away. Why would a man do all that work alone? Alma had asked. Mrs. Haverson had looked at her with a thoughtful expression. That, Miss Redmond, is the question everyone in Redrock would like the answer to. Alma had thought about it for the remainder of that evening, and she had made her decision somewhere between the last of the coffee and the lighting of the evening lantern. She would go to the Keller place. Not because she thought she would succeed where others had failed, not with any particular strategy or angle, but simply because it was the next thing to try, and she had never in her life given up on something simply because the odds were poor. She rose before dawn the following morning, dressed in the practical clothes she favored, a plain cotton shirt, a divided riding skirt that was not fashionable but allowed for actual movement, and boots that had seen better years but were still sound, and set out on the road northeast with her satchel, and the early light just beginning to pale the horizon ahead of her. The walk took just under 2 hours, and by the time the Keller ranch came into view, she was warm from the exercise and the morning sun that had fully risen over the flat land to the east. She stopped at the gate, a substantial wooden structure with the name burned into a crossbeam, and looked at what she saw. It was a well-kept place. That was the first thing that struck her. The fences were in good repair, the outbuildings looked sound, and the main house, while not grand, had the solid and weathered look of something built to last. A good-sized barn sat perhaps 100 yards from the house, and there were corrals beyond it that held a small herd of horses. Past the corrals, farther out on the open land, she could see cattle grazing in the morning light, maybe 200 head or more from what she could estimate at this distance. And there was the man. He was working one of the corrals, and even from the gate she could tell he was working hard. He was tall, broad through the shoulders, and he moved with the efficient economy of someone who had done physical work for so many years that it had become the natural language of his body. He was cutting a young horse from the other animals in the corral, using only his movement and his presence, no rope yet, no equipment, just himself and the way he read the animal's intentions before the animal fully formed them. It was good work. It was, in fact, excellent work. Alma watched it for a long moment before she unlatched the gate and walked in. She did not go directly to him. She set her satchel down against the fence post just inside the gate and looked at the layout of the place, the way the cattle were positioned on the far pasture, the condition of the water trough near the barn, the state of the hay that was stacked under a lean-to on the barn's east side. Then she did something that she had not entirely planned to do. She noticed that a section of fencing on the near side of the horse corral, not the one the man was working in, a smaller adjacent corral, had a board that had pulled loose from its post, hanging at an angle that would eventually become a gap a horse could push through. There was a pile of tools leaning against the barn wall nearby. A hammer, a coffee can that likely held nails, a pry bar. Alma walked over, picked up the hammer, found a nail of appropriate size in the can, and set the board back against the post. She drove the nail clean and true in 3 strikes, then added a second for good measure. She stepped back, checked her work, and found it sound. That was when she heard him stop moving in the adjacent corral. She turned and found Bernard Keller standing at the corral fence, one arm resting on the top rail, watching her. He was perhaps 30, maybe a year or 2 either side of it, with dark hair that had been pushed back under a hat that showed years of use, and a face that had been shaped by sun and wind and whatever private weather had moved through him in recent years. He had the look of a man who had been handsome before something had pulled some of the ease out of him, and perhaps still was handsome if a person looked without the distraction of that watchfulness in his dark eyes. Those eyes were fixed on her now with an expression she could not immediately name. It was not angry. It was not unwelcoming exactly. It was more like the look of a man who had expected one thing and found something else entirely, and was not yet sure what to do with the difference. "That board's been loose for a week," he said. His voice was low and even, with the particular flatness of a man who had learned to keep the color out of his tone. "I noticed," Alma said. She set the hammer back where she had found it. "I was going to get to it." "Of course you were," she said, and she meant it without any edge. "You have a lot to get to, anyone can see that." He was quiet for a moment, studying her. "You come to ask about work." "I did. I don't take on hired hands." "I know that. Everyone in Redrock knows that." She looked at him directly when she said it, not challenging, just honest. "I figured I'd come anyway." Something moved across his face, not quite amusement, not quite irritation, something between the two. "What kind of work are you looking for?" "Cattle work." "I can ride, I can read a herd, I know how to move animals without working them into a panic. I'm good with horses as well." She paused. "I saw you working that bay in the corral just now." She kept wanting to drift left. "You read it every time before she moved. That's not something everyone can do." The brief pause that followed was small but weighted. "You know what you were looking at," he said, and it was not quite a question. "I've spent 2 years watching drovers work at the pens in Abilene. Before that I grew up on a small farm in the hill country, and we didn't have money for hired help, so I learned to do everything that needed doing." She glanced out at the far pasture where his cattle were scattered in the morning light. "You've got a good herd, but you've got more land and more animals than one man can properly manage alone. I'm not here to tell you your business. I'm just stating what I can see." He was quiet again. It was a different quality of quiet than before. He was actually thinking, she realized, not just being closed off. He pushed off from the fence rail and walked to the corral gate, letting himself out and latching it behind him with the automatic precision of habit. He was taller than she had realized, and as he came closer she saw the fine lines of tiredness around his eyes that spoke of someone who had been working too hard for too long and knew it and kept going anyway. "You walked from town?" he asked. "Yes. That's 6 miles. I know how far it is." He looked at her for a long, measured moment. Then he looked out at the pasture. Then he looked at the corral fence where she had driven the nail, and something that might have been the very beginning of a different expression moved across his face before he controlled it. "Come back tomorrow morning," he said. "Same time. You start tomorrow." Alma held very still for a moment because she had genuinely not expected those words. She had hoped for them in the abstract, hopeful way one hopes for good weather or a lucky card, but she had not genuinely expected them. "All right," she said, because she was not a woman who wasted words when simple ones would do. He nodded once as if something had been decided and agreed upon, and there was nothing further to say about it. Then he turned and walked back toward the bay horse in the corral, and that was the end of the conversation. Alma picked up her satchel, walked back through the gate, latched it behind her, and started back down the road toward Redrock. She was halfway to town before she allowed herself the small, private smile that she had been holding back since she heard the words "you start tomorrow." She was back at the gate before sunrise the following morning. She had negotiated a reduced rate with Mrs. Haverson for a weekly board situation rather than nightly, since her new wage, whatever it turned out to be, because they had not yet discussed specifics, would need to cover her room and food and a small saving toward whatever came next. Mrs. Haverson had been both pleased for her and visibly concerned about the practicalities of the situation, and had sent her off that first morning with a wrapped biscuit and a practical warning to watch herself. Bernard was already working when she arrived. He was at the water pump near the barn, filling troughs, moving with the methodical rhythm of a man running through a morning routine. He had performed alone for long enough that the rhythm itself had become companionship. He saw her come through the gate and gave a short nod, the kind that substituted for good morning. "Horses need their stalls cleaned," he said without preamble. "Then I need the 3 young steers from the south pasture moved to the east pen. After that, we'll see what the day needs." "Understood," Alma said, and set her satchel inside the barn door and went to find the mucking fork. That first week between them was mostly practical. They worked alongside each other and separately, dividing the work without a great deal of discussion, because Alma had the habit of watching how a person operated before she inserted herself into the flow of it, and Bernard seemed to have the same instinct, or perhaps simply the long habit of solitude. He watched her work without being obvious about it. She noticed because she noticed most things, and she suspected he was watching for competence rather than any other reason. She gave him no grounds for doubt. She worked steadily, cleanly, without complaint and without unnecessary noise, and after the third day she could see that the watchfulness in him had shifted slightly. It was still there, but it had moved from evaluation to something she could not quite categorize. On the fifth day, something happened that changed the texture of the situation. They were moving a group of about 30 cattle from one pasture to another, a job that required 2 riders working the flanks while a third pushed from behind. And since there were only 2 of them, the configuration was inexact and required more attentiveness than the standard arrangement. Alma was working the left flank on a sorrel mare named Duchess that Bernard had assigned her, a horse with good instincts and a smooth mouth, and she had been managing a young steer who had the bad habit of testing the edges of the group, sliding toward gaps in the fence line whenever the opportunity presented itself. The steer made his move suddenly, bolting for a space between a fence post and a stand of scrub brush where the boundary was ambiguous. Alma had seen the intention in the steer's posture before the animal fully committed to it, that slight gathering of the hindquarters, that flick of attention toward the gap, and she moved Duchess into position before the steer had traveled 10 feet. Not aggressive, not panicked, just present, blocking the exit with calm authority, and the steer, finding the way closed without drama, turned back into the group with minimal disturbance to the rest of the herd. She did not look over at Bernard to see if he had noticed. She simply kept working. But later, when they had the cattle settled in the new pasture and were riding back toward the barn, he said, without looking at her, "You saw that before it happened. The young ones always telegraph it," she said. "You just have to watch the hindquarters." He was quiet for a moment. "My father used to say the same thing." It was the first personal thing he had said to her in 5 days. She did not push on it, did not ask about his father, did not treat it as an opening to deeper conversation. She simply let it sit in the air between them, which was the right thing to do, and after another moment he said, "You're a good hand, Miss Redmond." "Thank you," she said. And then, because it was true and seemed worth saying, "You run a good operation, Mr. Keller." That was, in the particular economy of communication they had established between them, a meaningful exchange. And something in the landscape of their working relationship quietly shifted after it, the way land shifts after a deep rain, not dramatically, but in a way that changes what can grow there. The weeks passed. October moved toward November, and the temperature began to drop in the mornings, the sky taking on that high, sharp clarity that came to the Texas panhandle in the fall. The work was hard, and there was always more of it than the daylight hours comfortably allowed, and Alma settled into the rhythm of it, with a satisfaction she had not known in a long time. She learned the Keller place the way she had always learned places she cared about, by moving through it carefully and paying attention, cataloging its particularities. The east pasture had a low spot that collected water after rain and needed to be watched during wet spells, so the cattle did not stand in mud and get foot trouble. The barn's north wall had a draft through a badly fitted board that needed to be stuffed with rags in winter, or the horses got restless at night. The young bay mare Bernard was training, whose name turned out to be Clara, had a habit of spooking at the shadow of birds in flight that no amount of desensitization had fully resolved, and needed a patient hand on open rides. She also learned Bernard Keller by the same method of careful attention, though he was considerably more complex than a pasture or a barn wall. He was 31 years old, she eventually learned, though not from him directly, but from a conversation she had with the owner of the feed store in Redrock, a garrulous man named Stokes who seemed to know the history of everyone in the county. Bernard had come to the Panhandle with his father, Charles Keller, when he was 19, and the two of them had built the ranch together over the following 12 years. Charles had died of a heart ailment 2 winters before, and Bernard had been alone on the place since then, though alone in this context meant having had a series of hired hands who had, one by one, been turned away. Stokes had theories about why, as did most people in Red Rock. The most popular theory involved a hand named Grady who had been caught attempting to alter the Keller brand marks on 3 steers, a serious offense that Bernard had personally walked the man off the property over, and which had reportedly involved a level of controlled fury that people who had been present still talked about in respectful tones. After that, Stokes said, Bernard had simply stopped trusting outside workers, and the ranch had suffered for it in ways that Bernard refused to acknowledge. Alma sat with this information and turned it over. She understood, in the practical and non-sentimental way that she understood most things, that the history of betrayal by someone in a position of trust could make a person seal themselves off, in exactly the way Bernard had sealed himself off. She understood it without judging it. What she found more interesting, and what occupied her thoughts in the quiet evening hours when she walked back along the road toward Red Rock, was the question of what had made him open the gate again. Not for any of the experienced men who had tried before her. For her. On a morning when she had walked in and fixed a loose board without being asked and said she would come back tomorrow. She thought she understood it, but she kept the understanding to herself. The first real conversation they had, not practical exchanges about the work, but actual conversation, happened in the 3rd week of November, on a cold evening when a front had come down from the north, and they were both in the barn seeing to the horses before the temperature dropped further. Alma was checking the hooves of a dun gelding named Frank who had been favoring his left front, and Bernard was on the other side of the barn repairing a bridle by lantern light. And for a while neither of them said anything, and the silence was the comfortable kind, the kind that does not need to be filled. Then Bernard said, "Where are you from originally?" She looked up. He was not looking at her, he was working the leather strap through a buckle and watching his hands, but the question was genuine. "Hill country," she said, "east of Mason, small farm. My mother and I ran it after my father left." She paused, then added because it seemed like appropriate context, "She passed 2 years ago. That's when I went to Abilene." "I'm sorry," he said, and there was nothing perfunctory about it. He said it the way a person says it who knows what loss actually feels like in the body. "Your father," she said quietly. "I heard it was his heart." He was still for a moment, then continued working the bridle. "It was. He was a strong man. I didn't expect it." Another pause. This place was as much his as mine. More maybe because he was the one who understood what it could be. I was just following his lead for a long time before I had any real vision of my own. "And now?" she asked. He finally looked over at her. In the lantern light, his face was less guarded than it was in the open day, and she could see something in it that she had only glimpsed before, something genuinely undefended, like a room in a house that the owner had forgotten to lock. "Now I know what I want it to be," he said. "I just haven't quite figured out how to get there alone." The word alone hung between them, not pathetic but honest, and she met his eyes across the lantern-lit barn and held the look for a moment before looking back down at Frank's hoof. "You're not alone now," she said. He did not respond to that, but when she glanced up a minute later, the line of his shoulders had shifted slightly, like a man who had set down something heavy enough that he had stopped noticing the weight of it. December came in hard and cold, with a blue norther that drove down from the Panhandle like it had a personal grudge. The cattle needed checking twice a day, the water troughs needed to be broken of ice every morning, and the horses required extra attention in the cold. And the result was that Alma and Bernard spent more time working in close proximity than they had in the milder months, often side by side, often in the barn where the body heat of the animals made it tolerable. It was in this period that the distance between them, which had already been narrowing steadily and without much fanfare, began to do something that neither of them was quite discussing yet, but both of them were aware of. Small things accumulated. He started having coffee ready when she arrived in the mornings, without comment, and she started arriving 15 minutes earlier so as not to waste it. They fell into the habit of talking while they worked, not always about the work, increasingly about other things, the kind of things that reveal a person in the telling. She told him about learning to read from her mother using a single Bible and a dog-eared almanac, and he told her about his father teaching him to read a sky for weather before he had any formal schooling in the subject, using the clouds and the wind direction and the way the animals behaved. She told him about a summer when she was 14 and had helped a neighbor woman deliver a foal alone at midnight when both the woman's husband and the nearest horse doctor were unavailable. And he laughed, a real laugh, full and brief and warm, and told her about the time he and his father had spent 3 days trying to coax a particularly cantankerous old bull into a trailer, and how in the end it had been Charles Keller's habit of carrying peppermint candies in his coat pocket that had solved the problem. She loved those moments. She loved the way he talked about his father, the mix of grief and humor and deep respect that colored every story. She could see, in those moments, what Bernard Keller was underneath the self-sufficient formality he had built around himself in the years since his father's death. He was someone who had a great capacity for warmth and connection, who had learned to lock it away not from coldness, but from the pain of losing the person who had been the primary recipient of it. She did not tell him any of this. She was patient. She had always been patient. It was a clear Friday morning in the first week of January, 1879, when things changed in a way that could not be taken back. They were in the south pasture checking the fence line, which needed attention after the ice storms had stressed several of the posts, and they were walking the line on foot, leading their horses, because the footing was still slick in the shadowed stretches. Bernard was testing each post by hand, checking for rot or looseness, and Alma was walking a few paces behind him, noting the places that needed immediate work versus the places that could wait for a warmer day. She slipped. It was nothing dramatic, just a patch of ice hidden under a thin skim of loose dirt, and her boot went sideways and she went down with more speed than she had time to brace for. She caught herself on one knee and one hand, which saved her from a full fall, but the impact jarred her shoulder hard enough to make her gasp. Bernard was at her side before she had fully registered what had happened. He had turned at the sound, moved fast across the icy ground with the sure-footed balance of someone who had spent winters on this land, and he was kneeling beside her with his hand on her arm, the other steadying her shoulder, and his face was close enough that she could see the worry in it, clear and unguarded and completely unaware of itself. "Are you hurt?" he asked, and his voice had lost its usual evenness. There was something under it, something urgent. "I'm fine," she said and tried to stand, and the movement of her shoulder sent a sharp protest through the joint that she could not quite hide. "You're not fine," he said firmly, and his hand moved from her arm to her shoulder, testing the joint with a careful pressure that was so different from his usual careful physical distance that she was momentarily startled by it. "Can you move it?" she demonstrated by rotating the arm slowly. It ached but moved. "Not dislocated," she said, "just bruised." He helped her to her feet, and then he did not immediately let go of her arm, and she did not immediately move away from the steadying contact, and they stood there for a moment in the cold January light, with the horses standing patient behind them and the fence line stretching out ahead, and something very specific happened in the silence between them. He looked at her, and she looked at him, and neither of them was pretending that this was purely practical anymore. Then he let go of her arm, and she took a step back, and they both looked at the fence line with the intense interest of people who are very committed to looking at a fence line. "That post," she said, pointing at one that was visibly leaning, "that one needs to come out and be reset." "Yes," he agreed, "it does." They spent the rest of the morning working the fence line, and neither of them mentioned what had just happened, and both of them were thinking about almost nothing else. In the days that followed, something had changed in the air between them the way weather changes, not dramatically, not all at once, but unmistakably. He stood closer to her than he had before. Not inappropriately, just closer, within the radius of contact rather than outside it. She found reasons to stay past the point where the day's work was strictly finished, helping with the evening chores, and he found reasons to let her, pouring a second cup of coffee or showing her some detail of the operation that she might have found on her own, but which he offered the way a person offers a thing they want to share. One afternoon he asked if she would look at Clara, the bay mare, whose training had stalled on a particular issue with ground work. Alma spent an hour with the horse, working through the problem with the kind of methodical patience that was her nature, and Bernard sat on the corral fence and watched. Not watching the horse, watching her. She knew it and did not address it, but when she brought Clara through the gate at the end of the session, having resolved the issue cleanly, she looked up and found him watching and did not look away. "How did you know to do that?" he asked. "I didn't entirely," she said honestly. "I guessed at what the problem was and tried the thing that seemed most likely to address it, and then adjusted when she told me I was close but not quite right." "You talk about horses like they're having a conversation," he said. "They are," she said. "You just have to know the language." He was quiet for a moment, and she could see him thinking, and then he said, "I feel like I've been having a conversation with you since you walked through my gate that first morning, and I haven't been quite sure of the language." She looked at him. The late afternoon light was long and golden, and it lay across the corral and across him and across the bay horse, and across the whole of this place that she had come to love over these past months, and she felt something open in her chest, wide and warm and clear. "I think you've been doing fine," she said. He got down from the fence. He was standing in front of her now, not quite arm's length away, and he had the look of a man who has spent a long time alone making decisions alone, and has arrived at the edge of a decision that he cannot make alone. "Alma," he said, and it was the first time he had used her given name. She felt it go through her like a note struck on a well-tuned instrument. "I want to say something, and I want to say it plainly, because I've been spending too much time these past weeks not saying plain things." "All right," she said. "I hired you because you fixed a fence board without being asked, and then looked at me like you weren't asking for anything except a chance to be useful." He paused. "That's not why I want you here anymore." She waited. "I want you here because the ranch is better with you in it, and mornings are better with you in them. And I realized sometime around Christmas that the thought of you walking back down that road to town at the end of every day and not coming back, I mean not ever coming back, was the kind of thought that I had to set aside quickly, or it did something to my chest that I didn't want to examine." Alma looked at him for a long, considering moment. Clara had moved to the water trough behind her and was drinking with the loud, satisfied sound of a horse that has worked well and been properly cared for, and the late light was fading at the edges and turning everything amber and rose, and the wind that had been cold all day had eased to something almost gentle. "I want to tell you something plainly too," she said. "I came to this ranch because I needed work, and you were the last option I hadn't tried. But I stayed, I've stayed gladly, every day, walking 6 miles each way gladly because of you. Because of who you are in this place and how you are in it, and because every morning I learn something new about you that makes me want to know the thing after that." She paused. That seemed worth saying plainly. Bernard Keller, who had built a ranch with his own hands and grieved his father alone, and turned away every hired man for 2 years because trust was a thing he had put away, and could not find the key to, that man stepped forward and took her hands in both of his, and held them in the way you hold something you have been looking for a very long time. "I would like to court you properly," he said, "if that is something you'd be agreeable to." Alma felt the smile come up from somewhere deep and warm. "I think I'd be very agreeable to that," she said. The courting, in the manner of two people who were already spending their days working side by side, and already knew each other's rhythms better than most couples know each other after a year of careful Sunday visits, was practical and tender in equal measure. It was coffee shared before the morning work and conversations that stretched past the point of usefulness into the territory of wanting. And it was the small particular attentions that a person offers when they are paying attention to someone they care for, the extra blanket he left draped over her saddle on cold mornings, the way she rearranged the sequence of the afternoon chores, so that the hardest work fell on him at the point of the day when she had observed he had the most energy rather than the least. There were also evenings, 2 or 3 times a week, where she did not walk back to town immediately but instead stayed for supper, and these were the best hours, sitting at the kitchen table in the house that he had built with his father while the stove put out heat and the wind moved around the eaves outside, talking about everything. His plans for the ranch, her memories of the hill country, books they had both read, the way the land looked in the different lights of different seasons. He had his father's journals, neat and precise records of every year of work on the place, and he showed them to her one evening with a care that told her how precious they were, and she handled them with the reverence they deserved. "He would have liked you," Bernard said. He said it simply, looking at the open journal in her hands, and she understood that this was one of the most important things he could have said. "Tell me more about him," she said, and he did for a long time, and she listened the way she listened to everything he said completely. The first time he kissed her was at the end of February, a mild evening for the season, standing on the porch of the house after supper. The stars were extraordinary, the way they were in that part of Texas in winter, thick and white and close-feeling, and they had been standing there looking at them in companionable silence when he turned to her. And she turned to him, and the distance between them was already small enough that the rest was simply the resolution of a question that had been building for months. It was gentle and certain, the way he did everything, and she put her hand against the front of his jacket and felt his heart beating under it, solid and real, and thought with the part of her mind that observed things even in the middle of moments. "This is what I came to Texas for." They were married on the 10th of April, 1879. The wedding was held in Redrock, in the small non-denominational meeting hall that served the community in the absence of a full church, which was a sore point with some of the more devout residents, but a practical reality of a young town. Mrs. Haverson was there, beaming with the proprietary pride of a woman who felt she had played a role in the outcome, which she had, in the sense that it had been her table and her coffee, and her pointed comment about the Keller place that had sent Alma northeast on that early morning. The feed store owner Stokes was there, and several of the neighboring ranchers and their families, and a few of the women from town who had become known to Alma in her months of boarding there. Alma wore a dress she had made herself from fabric she and Bernard had chosen together at the dry goods store in Redrock, a deep blue cotton that he had said, with a quiet directness that made her heart turn over, that he thought matched the color of the sky before a clear day. She wore her hair up, which she almost never did, and she carried a small bunch of early wildflowers that Mrs. Haverson's daughter had gathered that morning from the field east of town. Bernard wore his good coat and a clean shirt, and the look of a man who had arrived at something he had not known he was traveling toward, but which, now that he stood in front of it, felt inevitable in the best possible way. When she came down the aisle between the rows of wooden chairs and he saw her, his face did something that people who were watching would talk about later, privately, among themselves. It opened, like a room with the windows thrown wide on a perfect morning. "You're beautiful," he said when she reached him, quietly only for her, and she felt the words settle into her like warmth. The ceremony was brief and practical, as ceremonies in that time and place tended to be, but the words were real and they meant them. He slid a simple gold ring onto her finger that had been his mother's, he told her afterward, carried from back east when his parents had first come west, kept safe through 12 years on the panhandle, offered now with a significance that required no explanation. The wedding supper was held in the Keller barn, which had been cleared and hung with lanterns and paper decorations, And it was the kind of party that a small community in 1879 Texas could put on when it had a mind to more warmth and generosity than elegance, but more genuine for that reason. There was a fiddle player, an older man named Archie who could make a fiddle sound like it was happy and sad at the same time, and who was therefore perfectly suited to weddings. And there was dancing on the swept dirt floor, and food that the women of Redrock had brought in contributions of cornbread and roasted meat and preserves and pies. Bernard danced with her. He was not a natural dancer, but he was not too proud to be guided, and she had enough rhythm for both of them. And at some point in the middle of a waltz that Archie played slower and softer than the preceding numbers, Bernard held her close enough that she could rest her forehead against his jaw, and they stopped being particularly careful about the steps. "This is your home now," he said, his voice low against her hair. "For as long as you want it." She lifted her head and looked at him. "I want it forever," she said. "Is that specific enough?" He smiled, and it was one of those smiles that transformed his face entirely, that took the weathered solemnity of it and turned it into something lit from within. "That'll do," he said. The first year of their marriage was one of the fullest Alma had known. She moved fully onto the ranch, giving up her room at Mrs. Haverson's, and the transition felt less like a relocation and more like a settling, the way water settles into a vessel shaped exactly for it. She was no longer just a hired hand, though she kept working, because the ranch needed two people, and she was not the kind of person who stopped being useful simply because her circumstances had changed. She was a partner in the operation, and Bernard treated her as one in every practical sense, asking her opinion on decisions, listening when she offered observations, including her in the planning that shaped the year's work. They made changes to the operation together. Alma had been watching the cattle market and had a sense, based on what she'd learned at the Abilene pens and what she continued to read in the ranch papers and newspapers when they came through town, that there was a shift happening in the kind of cattle buyers wanted more emphasis on quality, on animals bred for meat as well as drive, rather than simply on volume. She presented this to Bernard one evening at the kitchen table with the same directness she brought to everything, and he listened without interrupting, which was one of the things she loved about him. "You're thinking we should start crossing the herd," he said when she finished. "Bring in some better bull stock." "I think it would be worth the investment in the next 2 years," she said. "The market is changing. The long drives from Texas north are starting to slow down as the rail lines push further in. The ranches that are already positioned for quality when the market fully turns will be ahead of the ones that pivot late." He was quiet for a moment, turning it over. "My father thought along similar lines," he said. He had a note in his journal from about 5 years back talking about how the trail drive era was going to end within a decade. "Smart man," she said. "He was." He looked at her across the table. "So are you." They began the process of upgrading their bull stock that spring, purchasing 2 registered bulls from a larger operation 3 counties east, and the decision proved sound over time, as the cattle they bred through the following years commanded better prices at market than the unimproved stock. In September of 1879, Alma told Bernard she was pregnant. She told him in the morning, before the day's work began, standing in the kitchen with the coffee hot on the stove and the early light just touching the window. She had known for 3 weeks but had wanted to be certain before she said anything. She was certain now. He went very still for a moment, the way he went still sometimes when something hit him hard in the center, not the surface still of a person shutting down but the core still of a person absorbing something large. Then he crossed the kitchen and put his arms around her with a gentleness that was almost careful, like he was newly aware that the world was something that could be broken, and that he was holding part of it. "Are you well?" he asked, his voice low against her hair. "I'm perfectly well," she said. "I'm strong as a horse, Bernard. We established this when I walked 12 miles a day for weeks without complaint." He made a sound that was half a laugh. "You walked 6 miles a day. 6 miles there and 6 miles back." "That is 12, he conceded. She pulled back and looked at his face. He was crying, she realized. Not fully, not in any dramatic way, but the edges of his eyes were bright, and the emotion in them was profound and uncomplicated, the kind of happiness that goes all the way down without any shadow in it. She reached up and put her palm against his jaw, and he turned his head and pressed his lips against it briefly, a gesture so private and sincere that she felt it fill some part of her that she had not known was empty. "Your father would have been so glad," she said softly. "He would have loved you," Bernard said. "I mean completely. I think he spent my whole life hoping I'd find someone like you and was too polite to tell me so." Their son was born in the early hours of a May morning in 1880. The birth was attended by the doctor from Riedrock, a capable and quietly kind man named Dr. Weiss, and by Mrs. Haverson, who had appointed herself a permanent fixture in the Keller family's important moments, and who was not wrong to do so. Alma labored for 8 hours, which Dr. Weiss said was entirely normal, and Alma thought was considerably inconvenient. And at the end of it the baby was healthy and loud in his announcement of himself. And Bernard, who had spent the night in the kitchen moving between sitting still and moving around because he could not manage either for long, came into the bedroom and looked at his son and his wife with an expression that she would remember for the rest of her life. He sat on the edge of the bed and she put the baby into his arms, and he held the child with the same careful competence he brought to everything, and looked at the small red face with its extraordinary vehemence and completely undirected fury at being thrust into the world, and said, "Hello, Charles." They had agreed on the name. She had suggested it, and he had needed about 4 seconds to say yes. Charles Keller was born loud and determined and with a grip like a young colt, and from the first days he gave every indication of being a person with strong opinions about how things should go. Bernard was besotted, which surprised neither of them. What surprised Alma slightly was how naturally fatherhood settled onto him. Not that she had doubted his capacity for it, but she had not anticipated how seamlessly it integrated with the rest of him, how the particular qualities she loved in him, the steadiness, the patience, the deep and quiet attentiveness, transferred directly to the work of raising a child. She watched him with their son early mornings when he sat with Charles at the kitchen table, and talked to him with the same serious conversational respect that he used with everyone, explaining the weather or the day's work or some observation about the horses as if the infant could fully follow the thread, and she felt something so large and warm and permanent settle in her chest that she stopped trying to find words for it and just let it be. The ranch continued to grow. They hired a hand in the spring of 1881, a young man named Willie Garza from a family that had been in the area for 2 generations, one of the Spanish land grant families whose deep roots in that country went back further than any of the Anglo ranchers. Willie was 18, quiet and competent, and had grown up working cattle and spoke the language of the land the way Bernard and Alma both spoke it, not as something learned from books, but as something absorbed through years of living close to it. Bernard was more careful about hiring him than he might once have been, not in the suspicious closed-off way of his solitary years, but in the thorough and fair way of a man who had learned that trust was worth being careful with. After a trial period of 2 months, he gave Willie a permanent position, and Willie became a fixture on the place in the years that followed. But the truth was that the operation, though growing, was not without its difficulties, and the difficulty that tested them most came in the summer of 1881. A dispute arose with a neighboring rancher named Daltrey, a hard man who had been a presence in the county for longer than Bernard and whose property bordered the Keller land on the west. The dispute was about water rights to a creek that ran along the shared boundary, and it was the kind of dispute that in the Texas panhandle in those years carried the potential to turn ugly. Daltrey claimed that the creek's primary flow gave him rights to draw from it before the Keller cattle could access it, and he had begun, that summer, to build a dam at the upper end of the shared boundary that would have, if completed, significantly reduce the water available to the Keller herd during the dry months. Bernard's first instinct was to go directly to Daltrey and address it man to man, which was how things were typically handled in that country, and Alma supported this approach, while also pointing out that they needed to understand their legal position before the conversation happened. She spent a week reading through the land grant documents and the county survey records, which she obtained from the county seat at some effort, and she found in them a provision that established shared and equal access rights to the creek for both properties, predating Daltrey's ownership and binding on all subsequent owners. When Bernard went to see Daltrey, he carried copies of the relevant documents. The conversation was not easy. Daltrey was the kind of man who had operated for a long time in a context where what he wanted and what was legal were the same thing, and being shown the difference was not an experience he took graciously. There were hard words, and the situation sat uncomfortably for several weeks, but Daltrey eventually ceased construction on the dam when the county agent visited and confirmed the legal standing of the documents Alma had found. "You did that," Bernard told her, the evening after the county agent's visit when they were sitting on the porch watching the late light die over the land. "We did that," she corrected. "You found the provision." "I would have gone to Daltrey without it, and it would have been my word against his, and that's a different argument than legal standing." She looked out at the pasture, where the cattle were settling for the evening, and the creek glinted in the last light at the western edge. "Your father purchased this land knowing those rights existed," she said. "It seemed right to know what he knew." Bernard reached over and took her hand, and held it in the particular way he had of holding her hand, not loosely, not formally, but with a settled certainty, like someone who has found the thing they were looking for and is not inclined to set it down. "Every day," he said, "I am grateful you walked through that gate. Every day," she said, "I am grateful the fence board was loose." He laughed and she laughed, and the sound of it went out over the land in the evening quiet and came back changed into something richer. Charles grew, and the ranch grew with him. By the time the boy was 3, in the spring of 1883, he was already following his father on morning rounds with the focused intensity of a child who has decided what he wants to be and is already practicing for it. He had Bernard's dark eyes and Alma's stubborn chin, and a personality that was somehow both of them and entirely its own, and he called the cattle by names he had assigned them himself, and took any correction to these names with a dignified lack of acceptance that was very difficult not to find amusing. In the late spring of that same year, Alma told Bernard she was pregnant again. This time she told him in the evening, on the porch, with the easy confidence of someone who has been through the thing before and knows what the shape of it is. He received the news the same way he had received the first, the core stillness, the careful embrace, but with an additional quality of ease that had not been present the first time, the ease of a man who has learned in the intervening years that things can go well. "Another Charles," he said. "Or not a Charles," she said. "There is that possibility." He smiled against her hair. "There is that possibility," he agreed. Their daughter was born in December of 1883, in the same bedroom where Charles had arrived, with the same Dr. Weiss and the same irreplaceable Mrs. Haverson in attendance, and she was a small fierce thing with Alma's brown eyes and a quality of alertness that seemed, from her first hours, like a personality already forming. They named her Clara, after the bay mare that had been Bernard's most challenging training project, and which had become, over the years, Alma's regular riding horse and a beloved fixture of the place. "It seemed right," Bernard said, when Mrs. Haverson raised an eyebrow at the name. "That horse is the reason I let Alma stay long enough to fix a fence." Mrs. Haverson said that was the most romantic thing she had ever heard that also involved a horse, and she was not wrong. The years that followed were full in the way that good years are full, not without difficulty, because difficulty was the natural condition of that land in that time, but with the kind of full and satisfying weight that comes when you are building something real in a place that matters with people you love. The ranch expanded in small, careful increments. Bernard's approach to growth was the same as it was to everything: thoughtful, unhurried, attentive to the land's own signals, rather than forcing it into a shape it did not naturally want to take. Alma pushed when pushing was warranted, which was regularly but not constantly, and he listened when she pushed, which was one of the qualities she valued most in him. Willie Garza stayed on, became indispensable, and by the mid-1880s was effectively the foreman of the operation, trusted and trusted fully. He was a good man who worked with an integrity that Bernard recognized and rewarded, and who treated Alma with the respect he would have given any competent person in a position of authority, which was the only kind of respect she had ever wanted. He married a woman from town, a schoolteacher named Rosa, in 1885, and their family became woven into the fabric of the Keller place in the way that good working relationships sometimes do over time. Charles, at 7, could already sit a horse better than most grown men in the county, which was not surprising given that he had effectively been raised between the barn and the pasture. He had his father's gift for reading animals and his mother's gift for patience, and he had also inherited some quality from one of them, or perhaps from the land itself, that made him the kind of person that animals simply trusted, which was not a gift that could be taught, and which both of his parents recognized and treated with the respect it deserved. Clara, at 4, was determined to do everything her brother did and furious at every turn when her shorter legs made this difficult, and she had a personality of such confident and charming insistence that even when she was demonstrably in the wrong about something she made it feel like a close question. In the evenings, when the work was done and the children were in bed, and the house was quiet with the particular quality of quiet that a family makes in a place it has thoroughly inhabited, Bernard and Alma sat on the porch in the weather that allowed it, or at the kitchen table when it did not. And sometimes they talked, and sometimes they were simply there. Two people who had each come to the panhandle looking for something they could not quite name and had found it in each other. He told her once, in 1886, on a September evening when the children were asleep and the sky was doing something extraordinary with the last of the light, that he used to dread the evenings in the years he had been alone. "Not because I was afraid of solitude," he said. "I understood solitude. I'd built a whole life around it. I dreaded it because there was always a moment, right around this time of day, when the work was finished and the land went quiet, and I would become aware of how much of the day I had stored up to tell someone. All these observations, small things, the way the light hit the pasture at noon, or the way Clara, the horse, then, had spooked at a jackrabbit. All these small things that only matter if you tell them to someone who cares about them." Alma looked at him. The light was going copper and long across the land. "And then you hired me," she said. "And then you fixed my fence," he said, and smiled. "And I spent the whole day after you left trying to convince myself that it would be a terrible idea." "What convinced you otherwise?" He was quiet for a moment. "I watched you walk back down the road toward town from the gate," he said. "And the moment you were out of sight, the ranch went back to being quiet the way it had been quiet before. Except now I knew it didn't have to be." She leaned over and put her head on his shoulder, and he turned slightly and pressed his lips to her hair, and they sat that way in the fading September light, while the land settled around them into the vast and quiet dark. The next year, 1887, brought a period of drought to the Panhandle that tested every ranching operation in the region with a pitiless efficiency. The summer was brutal hot beyond the ordinary brutality of the Texas summer, with weeks of no rain and winds that seemed to be pulling the moisture from the soil itself. The grass went brown and crisp in July, earlier than it should have, and by August the water in several of the smaller creeks had dropped to a trickle. Bernard and Alma managed the crisis the way they managed everything, with clear thinking and no wasted motion. They had built up their water storage capacity in previous years, partly in anticipation of exactly this kind of season, and the creek access they had protected from Daltrey's interference several years earlier was now more important than ever. They reduced the herd strategically, selling off older animals and those least suited to weather a hard season, retaining their best breeding stock and enough cattle to maintain the operation's core. It was a hard set of decisions, each one costing them in income and in the years of work that had gone into building the herd to its current size, but they were the right decisions, and they made them without flinching. Some neighboring ranchers were not so lucky or not so prepared. The Hollister spread, where Alma had been turned away on her second day in Reed Rock 9 years earlier, lost a significant portion of its herd that summer and barely kept the land. Several smaller operations folded entirely, their owners pulling out and moving on in the way that the frontier absorbed and expelled people, harsh and indifferent. Daltrey, whose dam-building ambitions of 6 years prior had come to nothing, found himself in severe difficulty that summer and came to Bernard in August with a proposal to sell a portion of his westernmost pasture, the land that included the upper reach of the shared creek, in exchange for immediate cash. It was a meaningful sum, more than they could comfortably afford, and Alma and Bernard spent 2 evenings at the kitchen table going over their finances with the thoroughness of people who have always understood that a ranch's survival is also a financial calculation. In the end, they bought the land. It was the right land to own, the creek headwaters providing security they had not had before, and the price, while stretching them, was a price they could manage if the herd recovered in the following years as expected. The transaction was civil and businesslike, and afterward Daltrey left the county, selling his remaining land to a man from Fort Worth who turned it to wheat farming, and the western boundary of the Keller Ranch became a natural one, the creek's course winding through land that was now wholly theirs. The drought broke in late September, a hard and generous rain that came down for 2 days steady, and left the land green within a week in the way that the panhandle could still surprise you with its resilience, its willingness to come back. Charles, who was 9 that fall and had spent the summer understanding for the first time that ranching was not only the good work of good days, but also the hard work of hard ones, went out after the rain and stood in the east pasture with his arms out and his face up, and Alma watched him from the gate and thought, with a fullness of feeling that she had no desire to contain or qualify, that everything she had come to Texas hoping to find had been given to her in ways she had not anticipated and could not have planned. The years after the drought were good years, recovery years, the kind that feel sweeter for what preceded them. The herd rebuilt. The ranch's reputation grew, based on the quality of the cattle they now consistently produced, the outcome of those decisions made years earlier about upgrading their breeding stock. Bernard's name was known in the county as someone whose word was sound and whose cattle were worth the price, and Alma's name was known alongside it, because in the world of practical working people there was no confusion about who was running that ranch. It was both of them together, and that was the reality of it, whatever the social conventions of the time might have preferred. Those conventions were not always comfortable. There were men in Reed Rock and the surrounding county who did not know what to make of a woman who worked cattle and made business decisions, and spoke her mind at meetings of the local Ranchers Association with the same directness she brought to everything else. Some of them admired it. Some of them were made uncomfortable by it in ways they could not quite articulate, and which expressed themselves as a kind of vague dismissiveness that Alma recognized and did not allow to diminish her. Bernard never permitted anyone in his presence to treat her as less than what she was, and he did it not as protection but as plain statement of fact, which was the most effective way and the way most consistent with who he was. In 1889, on a spring evening when the Panhandle was doing its spectacular best with the wildflowers that bloomed after a wet March, Alma and Bernard sat on the porch of the house they had shared for 10 years and watched Charles and Clara running in the south pasture, with Willie Garza's oldest boy in some complicated game that involved several fence posts and the deep seriousness of childhood logic. The horses were in the corral, and somewhere in the distance a dove was calling in the long light, and the ranch spread out around them, the buildings and the fences and the cattle and the land itself, solid and real and hard-won and entirely theirs. "I have been thinking," Bernard said, in the particular tone he used when he had been thinking about something for longer than the conversation would suggest. "I know," Alma said. "You've had the look for a week." He glanced at her with the quick amusement that had always been one of her favorite things about him. "Am I that transparent?" "Only to me," she said honestly. He was quiet for a moment, looking out at the pasture where the children were playing. "I want to build a new barn," he said, "larger, with a proper tack room and a treatment area for the horses. If we're going to expand the breeding program the way we've been discussing, we need the infrastructure for it." "Yes," she said, "we do. It's a significant investment." "It's the right investment," she said. "We've been putting it off for 2 years because the timing was never perfect, and the timing is never going to be perfect. The money is there. Let's build the barn." He looked at her, and in his look was 10 years of accumulated knowing, her mind, her certainty, the particular quality of her conviction that had never in those 10 years led them wrong when she felt it this clearly. "Let's build the barn," he agreed. The barn took most of the summer to build, with the help of Willie and 2 additional men from town, and it was an event of some note in the community, because Bernard built things the way he did everything, with meticulous care, and an insistence on quality that meant it took longer than strictly necessary, but produced something that would last. Several neighboring families came over on the day they raised the frame, an occasion that, in the tradition of that time and place, had the character of a community event, with food and company and the practical satisfaction of watching something useful rise from the ground. Charles, now 11, worked alongside the men with a serious competence that drew comment, and Clara, who was 7 and deeply annoyed by the implication that she should stand back and watch, worked alongside everyone else, and was eventually handed tasks appropriate to her size and skill by Willie, who understood children and understood Clara in particular, and who allowed her to do genuine work while also protecting her from the genuine hazards, which was exactly the right balance. In the evening, after the frame was up and the celebration was winding down and the guests had begun to drift toward their wagons for the journey home, Bernard and Alma walked out together to look at the structure standing in the early dark, the raw wood pale against the deepening sky. "It's good," she said. "It is," he agreed. He put his arm around her shoulders and she leaned into him, the way she had learned to lean into him over the years, not for support exactly, but for the particular warmth of contact with someone whose presence is a constant satisfaction. "Thank you," he said. "For what?" "For coming through that gate," he said. "For fixing the fence board. For coming back the next morning. For all of it." She tilted her head up and looked at him, and in the dim light his face was the face she had been looking at for 10 years, changed by those years in the ways that time changes a person who has lived fully and worked hard and loved well. Deeper lines, more silver in the dark hair, but the eyes exactly the same, that dark watchfulness that had become, over time, the most welcoming gaze she had ever known. "I would do all of it again," she said. "Twice." He kissed her then, under the open sky with the new barn rising behind them, and she kissed him back with the full, uncomplicated warmth of a woman who is home. The new barn became the center of an expanded breeding operation that, over the following years, established the Keller Ranch as one of the better-regarded producers of quality cattle in the Panhandle. Charles, who showed every sign of taking over the operation eventually with the particular mix of passion and competence that his parents had each brought to it, and which had combined in him into something remarkable, began spending his summers working the cattle beside his father and Willie with an increasingly professional purpose. Clara, who had her mother's eye for animals and her father's patience in working with them, showed a particular aptitude for the horse breeding side of the operation, and by the time she was 12, she was assisting with the training program in ways that were genuinely useful rather than merely ceremonial. The family grew in other ways too. In 1891, when Alma was 39, which was not considered a particularly advanced age for childbearing in the medical understanding of that era, though it was later than most, she became pregnant for the third time. She and Bernard had not precisely planned it, but neither had they been surprised by it, and when she told him, on a cold November morning with the stove burning and the children at school, he received it with the same settled happiness that had characterized him as a father from the beginning. "Another possibility," he said, with a smile that referenced their old exchange from years before. "Another person we don't know yet," she said, which was how she thought about it. Their second son was born in June of 1892, and they named him James, after no one in particular, but with the sense that the name was right for him in the way that a name sometimes simply is. He was an easy baby, round and mellow in ways that Charles had not been, and Clara had certainly not been, and he brought a particular quality of peace into the household that his older siblings found slightly disorienting, and his parents found entirely delightful. Charles was 12 when James was born, and regarded his new brother with the solemn protectiveness of a firstborn who has decided, irrevocably, that this is his responsibility. Clara was 9 and responded by becoming extremely informative about infant care to anyone who would listen, and several people who would not. Bernard held his second son in the barn. It was a summer day, and he had been working with the horses when Willie came to get him, and looked at the child with the same expression Alma had seen on his face twice before, that profound and uncomplicated joy, and she thought, watching him, that the man who had turned every hired hand away from his gate and worked his land alone and sealed himself against connection had become, through the particular series of accidents and choices and fence boards and long mornings, the most open and giving person she had ever known. She had not made him that. He had been that all along, underneath the grief and the caution. She had simply been the person who happened to show up on a morning when the right loose board was in the right place, and who had not left when leaving would have been easier, and who had recognized in him what he could not yet see in himself. The years rolled on in the good and ordinary way of happy lives, full of the small events that do not seem like history while they are happening but which make up, in aggregate, the whole of a life. The cattle operation matured into exactly what Bernard had envisioned when he described it to Alma in those early winter conversations in the barn. A place that was financially sound, productively run, and built to last into another generation. The land he had purchased from Daltrey in the drought year proved as valuable as they had foreseen. The creek's headwaters gave them a security that translated into confidence in the operations planning that a rancher without reliable water could not afford. Willie Garza remained, his own family growing up alongside the Keller children, his presence on the place as natural as the fence posts and the cattle. The friendship between the two families that developed over those years was one of the genuine ones, the kind built from shared work and shared difficulty, and the daily proximity of lives lived on the same ground. There were sorrows, too, as there always are. Dr. Weiss died in 1893 after a long illness, and his passing was felt by the community he had served so quietly and so well. Mrs. Haverson, who had been an adopted grandmother figure in all but name to the Keller children, slowed in her later years and eventually moved to live with her daughter's family in Amarillo, and Alma made the journey to visit her twice a year until the old woman died peacefully in her sleep in 1897, at an age that represented a full and well-used life. By the turn of the new century, when the frontier was becoming something else, less wild, more settled, the open range giving way to fences and the cattle drives fading fully into memory. The Keller Ranch stood as it had been built to stand, solid and particular, shaped by the hands and the minds and the love of the two people who had made it. Charles, 22 in 1902, had been working alongside his father as a full partner in the operation for 3 years, and had brought to it his own clear ideas about where things should go in the new century. Ideas that Bernard listened to with the same respect he brought to listening to anyone who knew what they were talking about and cared about the work. Clara, 19, and with the particular beauty of a young woman who has grown up outdoors and is entirely unaware of it, had developed into one of the finest horse trainers in the county, with a reputation that extended well beyond it, and she had plans of her own for the horse breeding side of the operation that were ambitious and well considered, and which made her mother feel, in the best possible way, like looking in a mirror. James, 10, was the most bookish of the three, which surprised everyone given the environment and surprised no one given Alma, who had always found equal comfort in work and in reading, and who had made sure her children had access to books even when books were not the most obvious priority of a working ranch. He was also, quietly, quite good with the cattle, in the way of a person who does something well without making a fuss about it. One evening in the spring of 1903, 24 years after the morning, Alma had walked through the Keller gate and fixed a fence board without being asked. Bernard and Alma sat on the same porch on which they had spent so many evenings, watching the same land at the same time of day, and the light was doing what the light in the panhandle always did in spring, pouring itself across the grass and the corrals and the new barn and the old house with a generosity that seemed personal. "I have been thinking," Alma said, using his old phrase, and he smiled without looking at her because he recognized it. "I know," he said. "You have had the look. Charles is ready to run this place," she said. "Not in some years. Now, he's ready and he knows it and you know it, and the only thing that hasn't happened yet is the conversation." Bernard was quiet for a moment. He was 56 and still strong, and still moved through the ranch with the efficiency of someone for whom physical work was as natural as breathing. But there were mornings when she saw him slow slightly in ways that he would not have slowed at 30, and she loved him too well to pretend otherwise. "You think it's time," he said. "I think it's getting to be time. Not to step away entirely. This is your land and your life, and it will be for as long as you want it to be. But to let him take the weight of the daily running. To give yourself the chance to be here for the reasons you love it, not just for the work that needs doing." He was quiet for a longer moment. She did not fill the quiet, because she had never filled his silences unless they needed filling. "What would I do with mornings?" he said, and there was something wry and something genuine in the question together. "The same thing you've always done with them," she said. "Ride out with the sunrise and look at the land and come back and drink your coffee and tell me something about the light or the cattle or the way the creek is running. Except without the part where you then spend 10 hours working yourself to the bone before the day is done." He looked at her. "And you?" She smiled at him, the full warm smile that she had always kept mostly for him, the one that reached her eyes. "I'll be right here," she said. "I'm not going anywhere. I have been here since 1878 and I intend to be here considerably longer." He reached over and took her hand and held it. His hand was the hand she knew as well as her own, the particular calluses of it, the warmth of it, the steadiness. "The best decision I ever made," he said, "was to say you start tomorrow." She turned and looked at him in the spring evening light. This man she had come to love so thoroughly that love had ceased to feel like the right word for it, and had become instead simply the name for the whole of how she moved through her days, the air she breathed and the ground she stood on, and the voice she wanted to hear when the day was done. "The best decision I ever made," she said, "was to fix the fence." He laughed, and she laughed with him, and the sound of it went out over the ranch, past the barn they had built together, and the pastures they had tended together, and the fences that had been fixed and fixed again over 24 years, out over the land that had been built into something real and lasting by two people who had found each other because a board came loose at the right moment on the right morning, and who had known, each in their own way, that whatever came next was worth the trouble of beginning. The sun went on going down over the panhandle, painting everything in colors that did not have names. The cattle moved in the far pasture in the last of the light. Somewhere in the barn, Charles was doing the evening rounds. Clara's voice came from the direction of the horse corral, quiet and steady, talking to one of the mares in the particular tone she had inherited from her mother, the tone that animals trusted. James was in the house, probably reading, the lamplight already yellow in the kitchen window. Bernard and Alma sat on their porch in the gathering dark, holding hands in the easy permanent way of people who have built something that will outlast them and know it and are glad. And the ranch was quiet around them with the full and settled quiet of a place that is well and truly home. There were more mornings ahead. There always were out here, where the light came early and the land was patient and the work of a life was never entirely finished but could be, at the end of a long good day, set down with satisfaction and picked up again tomorrow. And tomorrow. And tomorrow after that, for as long as the days kept coming, which they would, out here on the panhandle, with the sky wide and the grass growing back after every hard season and the creek running clear along the western fence line where a man and a woman had once stood together in the drought light and decided that this was worth fighting for. It was. It had always been. It always would be.